Yet, his father was not in the mood of perceiving much fine distractions. Ah, he cried, as soon as he appeared, in a tone that sounded like at once angry and exclusive. Gregor drew his head back from the door and lifted it to look at his father. Truly, this was not the father he had imagined to himself. Immediately, he had been too absorbed of late in his new recreations of crawling over the ceiling to take the same interest as before in what was happening elsewhere in the flat, and he ought really to be prepared for some changes. And yet, could that be his father? The man who used to lie wearily sunk in bed whenever Gregor set out on a business journey, who welcomed him back of an evening lying in a long chair in a dressing gown, who could not really raise to his feet but only lifted his arms in greeting. And on the rare occasions where did he go out with his family on one or two Saturdays or Sundays a year and on highest holidays. Walk between Gregor and his mother, who were slow walkers anyhow, even more slowly than they did, muffled in his old greatcoat, shuffling laboriously forward with the help of his crook-handled stick, which he set down more consciously at every step, and whenever he wanted to say anything, nearly always came to the full stop and gathered his escorts around him. Now he was standing there in fine shape, dressed in a smart blue uniform with gold buttons, such a bank messengers wear. His strong double chin bulged over his scuff-high collar of his jacket, and from under his bushy eyebrows, his black eye darted fresh and penetrating glances. His one-time tangled white hair had been combed flat on either side of a shiny and carefully exact parting. He pitched his cap, which bore a gold monogram, probably the badges of the same bank, in a wide sweep across the whole room onto a sofa, which the tail end of his jacket had thrown back. His hands in the trouser pockets advanced with a grim visage towards Gregor. Lucky enough, he did not himself know what he meant to do. At any rate, he lifted his feet uncommonly high, and Gregor was dumbfounded at the enormous size of his shoe soles. But Gregor could not risk standing up to him, swear as he had been formed of a very first day of his new life, that his father believed that only the severest measure suitable for dealing with him. And so he ran before his father, stopping when he stopped, and scouting forward again when his father made a very kind of a move. In a way, they circled the room several times without anything deceived happening. Indeed, the whole operation did not even look like a pursuit, even because it is carried out so slowly. And so Gregor did not leave the floor, for he feared that his father might take a piece of a pencil wickedness, any excursion for his over the walls or the ceiling. All the same, he could not stay this course much longer. For a while, his father took one step, he had to carry out the whole series of movements. He was already beginning to feel breathless. Just as in his former life, his lungs had not been very dependable, as he was staggeringly along, trying to concentrate his energy on running, hardly keeping his eyes open. In his dazed state, never even thinking of any other escape than simply going forward. And having almost forgotten that the walls were free to him, which in this room were well improved, with finely carved pieces of furniture full of knobs and crucifixes. Suddenly something lightly flung landed close behind him and rolled before him. It was an apple. A second apple followed immediately. Gregor came to a stop in alarm. There was no point in running on, for his father was determined to bombard him. He was filled with his pockets with fruit from the dish on a sideboard and was now shying after apple. Without taking particularly good aim for the moment, the small red apple about the floor of as if them magnetized and canned into each other. An apple thrown without a much force gazed, and Gregor back and glanced off harmlessly. But another following immediately landed right on his back and sank in. Gregor wanted to drag himself forward as if this staring incredible pain and he could be left behind him. But he felt as if nailed to be spotted and flattened himself into complete endangerment of all his sense. With his last Constant's look, he saw the door of his room being torn open and his mother rushing out ahead of his screaming sister in her underbodies. For her daughter had loosened her clothing to let her breathe more freely and recover from her swoon. He saw his mother rushing toward his father, leaving one after another behind her on the floor. He loosened petticoat, stumbling on her petticoat straight to his father and embracing him, in a complete union with him. But here Gregor's sight began to fail, with her hands clasped around his father's neck, as she begged for her son's life. This serious injury done to Gregor, which disabled him for more than a month, the apple went on sticking in his body as a visible reminder, since no one ventured to remove it. Seems to have made even his father recollect that Gregor was a member of the family, despite his parents' present unfortune and repulsive shape, and ought not to be treated as an enemy. On a country, family duty required the suppression of disgust and an exercise of a practice. Nothing but patience. And although his injury had empired, probably forever, his power of movement, and for the time being, it took him long minutes to creep across his room like an old invalid. There was no question now of crawling up the wall, yet in his own opinion it was sufficiently compressive for his worsening of his condition by the fact that toward evening the living room door, which he used to watch intensely for an hour or two beforehand, was always thrown open, so that lying in the darkness in his room, invincible to the family, he could be seen them all at the limit table and listened to their talk, by general consent, as it were, very different from his earlier eavesdropping. True, their intercourses lacked the living character for former times, which he had always called to mind of a certain wishfulness in the small hotel bedrooms where he had been wont to throw himself down, tired out, on damp bedding. They were now mostly very silent. Soon after supper, his father would fall asleep in his armchair. His mother and sister would admonish each other to be silent. His mother, bending low over the lamp, stitch at fine sewing for an underwear firm. His sister, who had taken a job as a sale girl, was learning short-handed and French in the evening, on the chance of bettering herself. Sometimes his father woke up, and as if quite unaware that he had been sleeping, said to his mother, "What a lot of sewing you're doing today." And at once fell asleep again, while the two women exchanged a tired smile. What kind of mulish his father could persist in keeping his uniform on even in the house. His dressing gown hung uselessly on its peg, and he kept fully dressed where he sat, as if he were ready to be servants at any moment. And even here, only the background of a call of his superior. As a result, his uniform, which was not brand new to start with, began to look dirty despite all the loving care for his mother and the sister to keep it clean. And Gregor often spent a whole evening gazing at the many greasy spots on the garment, gleaming and with the gold buttons always in a high state of polish, in which old man sat sleeping in extreme discomfort, but yet quite peacefully. As soon as the clock struck 10, his mother tried to resort his father with a gentle word to persuade him. After that, to get into bed, for sitting there he could not have a proper sleep, and that was what he needed most, since he had to go on duty work at 6. But with the mulishness had obsessed him since he became a bank manager, he always insisted on staying longer at the table, although he regularly fell asleep again. In the end, only with the greatest trouble he could get out of his armchair and onto his bed. However, intensely Gregor's mother and sister kept urging him with the gentle reminders. He would go on slowly shaking his head for a quarter of an hour, keeping his eyes shut, and refused to get to his feet. The mother plucked out his sleeves, whimpering endearment in his ear. The sister left for lessons to came with her mother's help, but Gregor's father was not to be caught. He would only sink down deeper in his chair, not until the two women hosted him by the armpits did they open his eyes and look at them both, one after another. Usually they remark, "This is the life, this is the peace and quiet of my old age." And leaning onto the two of them, he would have himself up. With difficulty, as if it were a great burden to himself, suffer him led him as far as the door, then wave them off and go on alone, while the mother abandoned her needlework, and the sister on her hand her pen, in order to run after him and help him further. Who could find time in this overworked and tired out family to bother about Gregor more than was absolutely needful? The household was reduced more and more. The servant girl was turned off. The gigantic bounty charwoman with white hair flying around her. I came in the morning and evening to do the rough work. Everything else was done by Gregor's mother, as well as the great piles of sewing. Even Vicious family ornaments, which was mother and sister, used to wear with pride, and parties and celebrations had to be sold. As Gregor discovered of an evening form hearing, them all discussed the prize obtained, but what they had limited most was the fact they could not have leave flat, which was too much big for their present circumstances, because they could not think of any ways to ship Gregor. Yet Gregor saw well enough the consideration for him was not the main difficulty presenting the removal, for they could have easily shifted him in some suitable box with a few errors holes in it. What really kept them moving into another flat was rather their own complete hopelessness and belief that they had been singled out for misfortunes such as they had never happened to any of their relations or acquaintance. They fulfilled to be uttermost all that the world demands of poor people. The father fetched breakfast for small clerks in the bank. The mother devoted her energy at making underwear for strangers. The sister could totter to and fro behind the counter at the behest of customers. But more than this, they had not the strength to do. And the wound in Gregor's back began to nag at him afresh when his mother and sister, after getting his father into bed and come back again, left their work lying, drew close to each other, and sat cheek by cheek. When his mother, pointing towards his room, says, "Shut the door now, Greety," where he was left again in darkness, while the next door the woman mangled their tears, or perhaps sat dry-eyed, staring at the table. Gregor hardly slept at all by night or by day. He was often haunted by the idea that next time the door opened, he would take the family's affair in hand again, just as he used to do. Once more, after this long interval, there appeared in his thoughts the figures of the chief and the chief clerk, the commercial travelers and apprentice, the porter who was a dull-witted 2 or 3 friends, or in a firm, a chambermaid in one of the ritual hotels, a sweet and fleeting memory, a cashier in the milliner's shop, whom he had wooed earnest but too slowly. They all appeared, together with strangers or people he had quite forgotten. But instead of helping him and his family, they were one and all unappreciable, and he was glad when they vanished. At other times, he would not be in the mood to bother about his family. He only filled with rage and at the way they were neglecting him. And although he had no clear idea of what he might care to eat, he would take plans of getting into the larder to take the food that was after all his due, even if he was not hungry. His sister no longer took thought to bring him what might especially please him, but in the morning and at noon, before she went into business hurriedly, pushed into this room with her foot at any food that was available, and in the evening cleared it out again with one sweep of the broom. Needless of whether it had been merely tasted, or as most frequently happened, which left unchecked. The cleaning of his room, which she now did always in the evenings, could not have been more hastily done. Streaks of dirt stretched along the walls. Here and there lay balls of dust and filth. At first, Gregor used to station himself into some particularly filthy corner when his sister arrived in order to reproach her with it, so to speak. But he could have sat there for weeks without getting her to make any improvements. She could use the dirt as well as he did, but she had simply made up her mind to leave it alone. And yet, with a touchiness that was new to her, which seems anyhow to have affected the whole family, she jealously guarded her claim to be the sole caretaker of Gregor's room. His mother once subjected his room to a thorough cleaning, which was activated by only means of several buckets of water. All the dampness, of course, upset Gregor too, and he lay whisperly, sulkily, and motionless on a sofa, but she as well punished for it. Hardly had his sister noticed the changed aspect of his room in that evening that she rushed in her high-dudgeon into the living room, and despite the imploring raised hands of her mother, burst into a storm of weeping, while her parents and her father, and of course had been startled out of his chair, looking on that in helplessness and amazement. They too began to action. The father reproached the mother on his right at not having left of a cleaning Gregor's room, to his sister shriek at his sister on his left that never again was she allowed to be cleaning Gregor's room, while the mother tried to pull the father into his bedroom. Since he was beyond himself with accusation, his sister, shaken with sobs, then beat upon the table with her small fist, and Gregor hissed loudly with rage because not one of them was shutting the door to spare him with a spectacle and so much noises. But still, even if the sister, exhausted by her daily work, had grown tired by looking after Gregor, or as she did formerly, there was no need for his mother's intervention or for Gregor's being neglected at all. The chairwoman was there. This old window, whose strong bony frame had enabled her to survive the worst a long time could offer, by no means recoiled from Gregor. Without being in the least curious, she had once, by any chances, to open the door of his room, and at the sight of Gregor, who, taken by surprise, began to rush to and fro, although no one was chasing him, merely stood there with her arms folded. From that time, she never failed to open his door for a little moment. Morning and evening, had to look at him. At first, she even used to call him to her, with words which apparently she took to be friendly, such as, "Come along then, you old dung beetle," or "Look at the old dung beetle then." Two such accusations Gregor made no answer, but stayed motionless where he stood, as if the door had never been opened. Instead of being allowed to disturb him so senselessly whenever the whim took her, she could rather have been ordered to clean out his room daily. That chairwoman. Once early in the morning, heavy rain was lashing in the window pins. Perhaps a sign of the spring was on the way. Gregor was so unexpected when she began addressing him again that he ran at her, as if to attack her, although slowly and feebly enough. But the chairwoman, instead of slowly fright, merely lifted a chair that happened to be beside the door as he stood there, with her mouth wide open. It was clear that she meant to shut it only when she brought the chair down on Gregor's back. "So you're not coming any near?" she asked, as Gregor turned away again and quietly put the chair back onto the corner. Gregor was now eating hardly anything. Only when he happened to pass the food laid out for him did he take it a bit of something in his mouth as a pastime, kept it there for an hour at the time, and usually spat it out again. At first he thought he was chagrined over the state of his room that prevented him from eating, yet he soon got used to various changes in his room. It had become a habit in the family to push into his room things where was no room for elsewhere. And there was a plenty of those now, since one of those rooms had been let to 3 lodgers. These serious gentlemen, all 3 of them wished full breads, as Gregor once observed enough. A creak in a door had a position for order, not only in her room, but since they were now members of a household, and all its arrogance and arrangements, especially in the kitchen. Superfluous, not to say dirty, objects they couldn't bear. Besides, they had brought with him most of his furnished things they needed. For this reason, many things he could be dispensed with that it was no use trying to sell, but that should not be thrown away either. All of them find their way into Gregor's room. The ash can likewise, and the kitchen garbage can. Anything that was not needed for the moment was simply flung into Gregor's room by the chairwoman, who did everything in a hurry. Fortunately, Gregor usually saw only the objects, whatever it was, and the hand that held it. Perhaps she intended to take things away again as time of the opportunity offered, or to collect them until she could throw them all out in a heap. But in fact, they just lay whenever she happened to throw them, except when Gregor pushed his way through the junk heap and shifted it somewhat. At first, out of necessary, because he had no room enough to crawl. But later, with the increasing enjoyment, although after such exorcisms, being sad and worried to death, he would lie motionless for hours. And since the lodgers often ate their supper at home in the common living room, the living room door stayed shut many an evening, yet Gregor reconciled himself quite easily into the shutting of the door. For often enough, on evening when it was open, he had disregard it entirely. I lay in the darkness corner of his room, quite unnoticed by the family. But on one occasion, the chairwoman left the door open a little and stayed ajar, even when the lodgers came in for supper and the lamp was lit. They sat themselves at the top end of a table where the former Gregor and his father and the mother had eaten their meals. Unfolded their napkins, they took a knife and fork in hand. At once, his mother appeared in the doorway with the dishes of meat, and close behind her sister, his sister with the dish of potatoes peeled high. The food steamed with a thick vapor. The lodgers bent over the food set before them as if so scratching his eyes yet before eating. In fact, the man in the middle, who seemed to pass for authorities with the other two, cut the pieces of meat as it lay on the dish, obviously to discover if it were tender or should be sent back to the kitchen. He showed satisfaction. Gregor's mother and sister, who had been watching anxiously, breathed freely and began to smile. The family itself took its meals in the kitchen. Nevertheless, father came into the living room before going into the kitchen with a one prolonged bow. Cap in the head made a round of the table. The lodgers all stood up and murmured something in their breads. When they were alone again, they ate their food in almost complete silence. It seemed remarkable to Gregor that among the various noises coming from the table, he could always distinguish the sounds of their masquerading teeth, and as if they were a sign to Gregor that one needed in teeth in order to eat, that with the toothless jaws even of a finest make one could do nothing. I'm hungry enough, Gregor sadly to himself, but not with that kind of food. How these lodgers are stuffing themselves. And am I dying of starvation? On that very evening, during the whole of his time there, Gregor could not remember being ever heard of violin. The sound of violin playing came from the kitchen. The lodgers had already finished their supper, and one in the middle had brought out a newspaper and given the other two a page apiece. And now they were leaning back at ease, reading and smoking. When the violin began to play, they picked up their ears, got to their feet, and went on a tiptoe to the hall door where they stood huddled together. Their movements must have been heard in the kitchen, where Gregor's father called out, "Is the violin playing disturbing you, gentlemen? It can be stopped at once." "On the contrary," said the middle logger. "Could not the Fullerton semester come to play in the room beside us, where it was much more convenient and comfortable?" "Oh, certainly," cried Gregor's father, as if he were the violin player. The loggers came back into the living room and waited. Presently, Gregor's father arrived with the music stand, his mother carried on the music, and his sister with the violin. His sister quietly made everything ready to start playing. His parents, who had never let rooms before and so had an exarranged ideas of a courtesy due to the loggers did not venture to sit down on their own chairs. His father leaned against the door, the right hand thrust between the two buttons of his living coat, which was formally buttoned up. But his mother was offered a chair by one of the loggers said, since she left the chair just where he had happened to put it and sat down in a corner to one side.